Good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's forum. We'll be getting started shortly. We'll give people time to join the chat and to join the live stream, and we'll get started in about 3 minutes.
Private chapter.
Again, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I see a few people have joined the live stream. We're going to go live shortly and start our program for this evening, which will be on redistricting in New York City neighborhoods. We have some really good experts with us here tonight, and we're just giving people a minute or so just to log on. Okay, good evening. My name is Jamela Rose. I'm the Deputy Public Advocate of Civic and Community Empowerment at the Office of the New York City Public Advocate. We're excited to have you join us tonight as we go over the redistricting process in New York City. This redistricting process, of course, happens after the decennial census and happens every 10 years. And so we're looking forward to getting through some of the data. We have Dan Kaminski, who's the Policy Manager of Citizens Union. He's there, he's waving in the corner. We also have with us Dr. Zulema Blair. Let me just read her title properly. Dr. Zulema Blair, the Director of the Redistricting Center for Law and Social Justice, who's gonna be hashing through some of the data with us. And and also I wanna introduce to you Faraine Griffith, who is the community organizer for the Office of the New York City Public Advocate. So Dan, I'll give you a minute to introduce yourself, and then Dr. Blair, and then Faraine. Just unmute yourselves when you want to speak.
Sure. So firstly, I just want to say it is such a pleasure to be here. I have such deep respect for Dr. Blair and for the Public Advocate and all the work that you all do. So it's an honor to be on this panel. My name is Dan Kaminski. Currently, I work for an organization called Citizens Union. And our whole goal during this redistricting process is civic engagement. So tonight, we'll be talking about the process and how it all works, but really from my angle at the very least, and I think Dr. Blair's as well, and the Public Advocate's Office as well, our goal is to get you to engage in the process. And so hopefully you feel more equipped to do that by the end of tonight. And yeah, pleasure to be here.
Dr. Blair, you might be muted.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for having me. Thank you to the Office of the Public Advocate, Amalia Rose, and Faraine Griffith. Thank you. Thank you, Dan. It's been a pleasure serving with you. And like I said, we're redistricting buddies. My goal here is to ensure that New York City and all who's watching understand the redistricting process and participate as much as possible in the redistricting process. And so I'm here, I'm from Medgar Evers College, serving in multiple capacities, chair of the Department of Public Administration and redistricting research director at the Center for Law and Social Justice. So glad to be here.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Faraine Griffith, and I'm the community organizer for Civics and Community Empowerment. I'd like to welcome you all this evening for this great teaching. I want to thank our partners the Center for Law and Social Justice, Medgar Evers College, and Citizens Union. Thank you.
All right. So just so that people understand what's going to happen, I'm going to introduce our two guest panelists, and then Fareen and I will drop to backstage. So you will not see us or hear us, but we will be here and interjecting as necessary to keep the program moving. So with that, let us dig in with our first section. So we've done our opening of programs, our intros. What is redistricting and why is it happening now? Dr. Blair, can you take us through a little bit of the history and the technicalities of why we are here at this moment? You might be on mute.
Yes. Every 10 years after the census, we go through what we call the redrawing of political lines, also known as redistricting. This is, our process is really governed by the Voting Rights Act, although, redistricting has been around for centuries, since the very first census in 1790. And we redraw districts because people move. People move for political reasons, economic reasons, social reasons. And so we start with the state process at the congressional state level, and then we move to the local level. So it's constitutionally mandated, right, of local, state, and federal political boundaries every 10 years. And so now we're up to the city council. And the city council has a pretty interesting history. Actually, the current executive director of the commission was involved in how these 51 districts came into being, because we used to have in New York City what you call at-large elections. And then we saw that that many racial and language minorities were being defeated in terms of selecting a candidate of their choice in at-large districts in at-large New York City, where they had just many people voting for the top 35 individuals. And so 51, after a lawsuit was filed in the 1980s, Plateau versus Anderson, and many other lawsuits under the leadership of some political astute individuals, Bedford Stuyvesant, et cetera, and throughout New York City, we now have 51 city council districts. And since then have had this embedded in the New York City Charter in Section 2A, Sections 50, 51, and 52, if you want to look. So this is about making sure that communities stay together, that communities are able to select a candidate of their choice, that they are able to do so to make sure that they are able to achieve policy goals and legislative agenda, whether it's for education, whether it's for economic interests or business interests, all along the lines of community of interest, whether it's for affordable housing. And what this does is preserve those districts. So it's not by accident that we have in several of our New York City Council districts demographic representation, because we want that to breed substantive representation, and the substantive part being along the lines of a policy agenda, a public policy agenda. So.
Dan, did you want to add to that at all?
No, I think that was a wonderful, wonderful summation of what it is and why it's happening. So yeah.
Okay, Dr. Blair, did you want to get in a little bit about the city council right now, or the commission?
Oh, sure. So as a result of us having 51 city council districts, we have what we call an independent districting commission. And so again, it's governed by the New York City Charter, and it's appointed 15 members, a 15-member commission, and the city council chooses 8, 5 from the majority, 3 from the minority. So 5 from the Democrats, 3 from the Republicans, and you cannot have no more than 1, or they should not choose no more than 1 representative in each borough. So all the boroughs are represented. And then the mayor chooses 7 or appoints 7 people. of which they cannot be, and these members cannot be a member of any of the city agency or work for the city agency, rather, any New York City agency. So you have a 15-member commission, and the purpose of that odd number, of course, is to break any, is to have a majority number when it's time to file with the city clerk. So the process is usually 2 rounds of hearings, but there is a possibility for a 3rd round. So in the beginning, as soon as the districting commission is appointed, that 15-member, they begin meeting. We had our first hearing where different members of the community came to meet in May 25th. And so we had a first round of hearings. Shortly after, a first round of maps were produced in July 15th. There is a public comment period. So just like any legislation where you have a notice and comment period, and the comment period is going on as we speak. 30 days after that, a second set of maps are produced and a second round of hearings are held. After these rounds of hearings are held, the city council gets to vote. The plan is submitted to the city council. The city council gets to, I wouldn't say vote, accept or reject or comment on the plan. If they reject it or vote it down, we have a 3rd round of hearings. So that is it in a nutshell. But what I want to stress is that in February, this will be filed with the city clerk. And so redistricting is a short process with a lot of leverage on how our quality of life is governed for the next 10 years. So I suggest you get on board now.
Thank you for that in-depth explanation. You went a little bit into like the process and the timelines and some of the things that we're looking forward to doing in August, which is fine. Let me slide over to our next section with Dan. Dan is going to head this part up. And can you tell us a little bit about why this matters so much and how does it affect us? So, for instance, tonight I see there's a lot of people from Staten Island in the house. I see Manhattan in the house, some district leaders, but they may know, but for the constituencies that they represent, and other people, who may just be our next door neighbors, the other parent coordinator in the school or whatever. Why does this matter to us and how does it affect us in our community?
Totally. So thank you again so much. So at the most basic level, the lines we draw will affect who can ultimately win an election, and who ultimately wins an election results in all sorts of legislative and policy changes potentially for the community. But specifically, so I'll give a theoretical example and then I'll give a more practical set of examples. I'm going to share my screen just quite quickly to show the visual. Let's make sure.
I can see it, Dan. I'm going to add it as soon as it's on the right.
Great. Okay. So
there it is.
Okay, so the more hypothetical example, which I'll do visually and hopefully will kind of take home a point, is let's just say that these 4 squares represent New York City. And let's say that these black lines represent the district lines as they currently are. And let's say these circles represent different communities of interest. And we're foreshadowing this. We're going to define community of interest a little bit later on and kind of get into the weeds on what that means. But for now, just, your community of central concern, whatever that may be. So let's say this gray circle is your community of interest. These other circles are other communities of interest, right? And so again, whatever that is, maybe it's your school district, maybe it's your religious community, maybe it's your business district or your businesses, maybe it's your housing type that you're a renter and these are all the renters in your community. Maybe it's your transit hub, right? And again, we're going to get more into communities of interest, but for now, let's just say that gray circle is yours. Now, again, just for the purposes of this example, in this configuration of the New York City boundaries, whoever is representing this red square, let's say each of these squares is a different district, whoever represents this red square, may not take the concerns of your community all that seriously if this were the map, right? You're kind of off to the side, you're off in a corner, you don't have that many voters. And at the very least, we can say pretty confidently that they'll take the concerns of your community much less seriously, or it will be much less loud for that council member than the people in these other communities of interest, right? That could theoretically mean less funding, less resources, less legislation, less advocacy, less media attention, and all of the lack of those things theoretically could mean that whatever the issue is that you are concerned about could get worse, right? It's not getting the resources and attention and advocacy it needs. So where redistricting comes into play is it allows us to redraw the lines and theoretically do something like this, right? So if this were our mapping configuration, or this was what we were advocating for, now whoever's representing this red square will have to take into account the concerns of your community, because you're smack dab in the center of the community. You're not split up between multiple different districts, and you're a very significant voting block within that district, right? So probably the outcomes for whatever your concern is, whatever the issues that most are important to you, this mapping configuration would yield far better results than this mapping configuration, right? So this is kind of the heart of what redistricting allows us to do. A little bit more practically, and again, maybe a lot of people on the call know this, sorry, I'm jumping around trying to find the slide I want. So right now, again, and just to be very clear, we're talking about city council redistricting only, right? So as Dr. Blair mentioned, I'm sure people have seen headlines. It has been quite a couple of months or even year with the state process. But right now, again, we're only focusing on city council, which is getting redistricted, which, to be clear, is run by a different set of rules and plays by and run by a different commission than the state level. So this will affect who ultimately can be elected and what the council districts look like for every council district in New York. And council, often I like to say, look out your window, and virtually everything you're looking at, your council member has effect over, whether that's the streets or the parks or schools or issues of policing or, really you name it. And the trash, you name it. And the basic, how it feels to live in your neighborhood, your council member is the person that I would argue has the most important role of a lot of essential issues. So, of course, a lot of people are really focused on state and federal politics, and all that stuff is super important. But we're talking about neighborhood issues, like, every day, what it feels like to live in your neighborhood. I would say it's your council member who has one of the most important roles to play in a lot of issues. So at the most basic level, just to go over it quickly, council members have really important powers over one, land use is a big one, right? So this gets really complicated, but just to make it quite simple, during rezoning applications, there's the tradition of member deference, which says that the rest of the council often votes how the council member from that neighborhood votes. So that gives council members a lot of power over the built environment of your neighborhood, right? Is there a 30-story tower in your neighborhood or not? What is the, what are the land use happenings of the district, right? So land use, they have discretionary funds, right? So this is straight up resources and how they're allocated in communities, which is so essential. Members get millions of dollars in discretionary funds to spend in their district. They're the legislative body of New York City, right? So what legislation is being advocated for is being pushed through City Hall. The budget, right? So they play a key role in the budget. And I would say the budget is the most important thing that happens in our city every year, right? It is a moral document that's choosing what we're funding and how, and having someone that aligns with your values on the council to push for the budget items that you want, again, really quite essential. And then, of course, they are constituent services at the most local level. So these are some reasons why it matters. And again, how the lines get drawn ultimately really do impact what ends up happening ultimately with the council. And Dr. Blair, I don't know if you want to add anything or.
Oh, sure. And thanks for that, because to tie it all together, precisely what I mean about quality of life. Dan summed it up nicely, right? So if you are looking at the quality of life that you want to have and who best could represent those interests, because everyone has a passion, this is a process that you need to get into because you want to play on the map with how your district should look, and you want to know which community of interest you represent. And so again, so communities of interest could be along language lines, ethnicity. It's generally, we try not to use race. It's always along communities of interest. So for example, where we shop. So do you care about your business strips the most? Is it safe? Is it, does it have all your needs? Or is a small business hiring in your community? Are they helping to decrease the unemployment rate? So you wanna have some type of issue that is a legislative consideration, as Dan pointed out. And so this is why you wanna make sure that you are identifying, self-identifying with the community of interest. And so I will point out in the Bronx, the Northern Bronx, what is their specific community of interest besides being along ethnic Caribbean lines? Is it because they all shop along Gun Hill Road, for example, or they all look at the transportation system in the same fashion and ride the same subway lines and want to advocate to their elected officials along that line? And so just to be clear, you come together along a community of interest in a particular geographical area to select the candidate of your choice. Sometimes we think that it's the other way around. But if you understand your geography, what your lines are, where you think it should be moved to, and you don't have to be sophisticated, you can use a pen or a crayon or go online and print something out and say, this is what I want my lines to look like. And these are where I think the boundaries should be, because these are the communities of interest that this area is about. Then you're part of the process and you're helping to affect change and increase the quality of your life.
Thank you so much for that, both Dr. Blair and Dan. I think we covered a lot of ground, and I actually want us to go into another section when we're talking about what criteria the commissioners use to draw maps. But before we get into that section, I just wanted to circle back to our previous section where you were talking about earlier, the August hearings, what the commission is responsible for, the council's role. And I know that you had wanted to touch a little bit on the Unity Map Coalition, and you can do that in this next section, or if you wanted to, you can kind of jump into that now a little bit, just to talk a little bit about the advocacy efforts that's happening that people may want to know about.
Sure. So the Center for Law and Social Justice, this is our third round for the City Council, and it was the second round for state and congressional. We're a part of what we call a Unity Map Coalition. And it's a group that consists of the Center for Law and Social Justice that represent people of African descent throughout the 51 city council districts throughout New York City, the Asian American Legal Defense Fund, and Latino Justice Pearl Deaf, Puerto Rican Legal Defense Fund, it was once called. So it's Latino Justice, but they still claim the name of Pearl Deaf. And so because of its historical factors. And so three groups come together and negotiate boundaries. This is not to say that significant presence may be in one district, but we negotiate our boundaries in terms of what are our communities of interest and why we think those boundaries should be kept the way it should be. This makes it easier, we think, for a commission. Once language minorities, which the Voting Rights Act and the Districting Commission know that that's the priority, for making sure that the voices of racial and language minorities are heard and are not diluted. In other words, according to Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, they're not cracked in a district where they're separated and can't select a candidate of their choice, where that has happened on several rounds, or they are not packed in a district where, for example, they're not 80% of Latino or people of African descent or Asians in one district, where they could have been split up decently to effectively select more than one candidate of their choice into different districts. And so the Unity Map Coalition, we negotiate those boundaries to make sure our voices are heard throughout the political process. And so what that also does is help us to mobilize different groups in that constituency. So the Center for Law and Social Justice will hope to mobilize community leaders and community residents in those districts. And the same goes for All Deaf and Latino Justice. And the commission, whether it's at the state, local, or state or local level, they often respect the negotiation that takes place along these groups because they know that the Voting Rights Act is a primary concern. Other concerns is to make sure that the district is compact. So if you think of a rectangle or square, how much do you sort of deviate for it? It's what it appears to be in the naked eye, and that it's contiguous, meaning that the districts are kept together and they're not separated across from one end of the district to another. So those are some of the criteria. Also have, we could only, population is a big issue because most people would say, no, we want our districts across this bound, but that's where one person, one vote comes in. And the district based on the census has to be of a certain population and can only deviate from the lowest populated district to the highest populated district by 5%. So the ideal number, the perfect number for your district should be 172,000.
Dr. Blair, let's back up a little bit. Let's back up a little. Because I know you have all this data. Both you and Dan have all this data and swimming around. We are neck deep, chin deep in redistricting right now. Let's backtrack just a little bit. Okay. So I know you were talking about data cracking and packing and all of that. Do you want to just explain to people? And I know that we're in this next section and we're running about 7 minutes behind schedule, everyone. So let's be honest where we are. But it's okay. It's okay because we're doing some good work right now. But do you want to, right now, since we're talking about like the criteria and pretty much like what commissioners are going to use to draw these maps, you mentioned the cracking, you mentioned the packing. Can you just take a step back and let our listeners know what that even means to them? For instance, if I'm just somebody who lives next door, I may not know what cracking, packing means. And then we can get into some of the examples and like crossover districts, overpopulated districts, underpopulated, and kind of work through some of that.
Great. Well, they sort of all go together. As I mentioned in the beginning, people move and populations grow. The Asians had a high growth rate, Latinos, et cetera. And so when population grows and people move in particular districts become overpopulated. And we know this because we take a census count. And the census count gives us the exact number of what it should be in a particular district. And so New York City had a population count of 8,800,000 and divide that by 51 districts and you get 172,882. And so if you have a district that exceeds that by a large amount, and I would say at this point over 5%, because that's a deviation mark, then that representative, that city council member will not be able to serve that district effectively. They will not be able to hear all the concerns of the constituents. They will not be able to provide all the resources that the census count provides for. The school districts will be short of funding. You won't be able to build the type of affordable housing that you need in your community because it's overpopulated, and you may have more individuals who are out of housing than not. For example, your school classrooms will be overpopulated. So you want the exact count or a short deviation from the optimal amount in your district so that you can be effectively represented. Also, you want to make sure that there is one person, one vote. And what that means is that everyone's vote is equal Years ago, what would happen is that we would have prison populations counted in their upstate region, and they never really lived in that district. And so resources went to that district upstate where all the prisons were, and that representative didn't have to worry about anything. And so that was I would say, an unjust enrichment, if you will, for that particular district, versus resources remaining in New York City, where most of the incarcerated population was. Now we have an adjustment to our population in areas such as Harlem and different parts of people of African and Latino descent communities. And so you want to make sure that everyone's vote is equal and that people receive the resources the way they need to receive it. Dan, do you want to add anything there? Or?
Sure, yeah. I'm happy to. Thank you, Dr. Blair, for that. And I think, I have some slides on this that hopefully will help demonstrate some of the points that I think you're making quite beautifully. So I can pull them up, and feel free to chime in with any of it. Whoopsie. Okay, so criteria stuff, I know we're running a little behind, so we'll have to do this quickly, and you covered a lot of them. To just be clear, so, again, the commission has to run by a bunch of rules for how they're drawing the maps. There are 8 total rules. Of those 8, and Dr. Blair mentioned several of them already, 4 of the rules are required. 4 of the rules are sort of as much as possible. So I don't think we have time to get into all 8 of them, and I don't think it's even necessary, but just to kind of give you a feel of why are they choosing the lines they're choosing? Why are they doing what they're doing? So the first one, which Dr. Blair was just talking about, is this one person, one vote idea. Sorry, let me put this on full screen mode. Which just the theory behind it, which what she just said, I think it explained it really well, but just to give you kind of the idea behind it is that if you have one district theoretically with one person, one district with 1 million people, obviously the level of representation afforded to those different populations is radically different. That one person has a lot of power, that 1 million people don't. So each district should have about the same number of people. And that is one of the major drivers of this whole process, because you want each 10 years, as population changes, you have to readjust. So in New York terms, as Dr. Blair just mentioned, when you take our population of 8.8 million, you divide by how many districts we have 172,000 people. A 5% deviation is allowed, which says that it doesn't need to be exactly that number. You can, plus or minus 5% from the smallest district to the largest district. So that's what we're working with. And to show you the map of New York City, so orange districts are underpopulated. So that means they're below that ideal percentage that I just showed you. Green districts are overpopulated, right? So when you take these factors combined, right, 630,000 person growth over the last 10 years, combined with the fact that we used to allow 10% deviation between the smallest and largest district. Governor Hochul just signed into law in October a 5% deviation. So now we have less wiggle room and a lot more people. That means a lot of districts are going to change, right? To just pull up some data, I don't actually know who's on the call offhand, but just to pull up some census data. So we're looking at it again. We're talking to Manhattan and Bronx today. So a big example is CD3, Council District 3, is overpopulated by about 30,000 people, right? If you remember, the ideal population is 172,000, give or take. This district now has 202,000 because of just an explosion of housing and growth in that and development in that district. So that means that 30,000 people from that district over the coming months will wake up and, without having moved, be drawn into a different district. That is inherently political, right? Or rather, it has inherently political consequences in that who they're represented by and how they are represented will radically shift, right? So that's that first one. To just kind of continue on what Dr. Blair was saying with the population. She's been mentioning cracking and packing a lot. So this is just a visual example of what that means, right? So the Federal Voting Rights Act, one of the most important pieces of legislation to come out of the civil rights movement. There's endless amounts to say about that, but just for time, according to the language of the bill, is to protect the racial and language minority groups, and City Charter has a similar idea. And so the idea is you have to keep them in one district. You can't divide different groups up between districts, because that dilutes their voting power and their opportunity, their ability to elect a candidate of their choosing. And so visually what that means is, let's say this square on the left is a protected group under the Voting Rights Act. A new map could not do what we're seeing on the right, because what that would do is would divide that group and would split up their voting power, would dilute their voting power so that they would not have the opportunity to elect a candidate of their choice. That's the second criteria. We're going to skip a few, although she mentioned, Dr. Blair mentioned these all. So I think hopefully you're kind of comprehending how they're thinking about it. Crossover districts, Dr. Blair mentioned, with which, again, just to define quickly, different districts should, you have to be contained within one county. And if you do cross over county boundaries, it can only happen one time instead of two boroughs, right? So all of these, the last one I'll mention, and then Dr. Blair, feel free to jump in, is community of interest, which is a term that we've talked about a lot today. And it really is kind of the hinge of people's testimony. So I'd like to just define it verbatim here. A community of interest is a neighborhood, community, or group of people who have common policy concerns and would benefit from being maintained in a single district. Another way of understanding a community of interest is that it's simply a way for a community to tell its own story about what neighbors share in common and what makes it unique when compared to surrounding communities. It's defined by local community members. So I think what stands out to me about this definition is, unlike some of the last criteria I showed you, which is very strict parameters on what is and what is not allowed, this is the opposite, right? This is the commission saying, hey, you all tell us what your community is, and we'll do our best to keep it together, right? So unlike, I think this is a very vague definition, but that's a good thing, right? So some examples, but really you can throw these examples out the window because you're the experts in your community. Again, might be your school board, or your school district rather, your transit hub, your major business district. Dr. Blair mentioned Gun Hill Road, for example, your religious community, your housing type. These are common ones that you hear, but again, whatever you feel like your community is, that needs to be maintained geographically in one district to get maximum power, is what your community is, and you're the expert in that, and it's correct. There's no right or wrong with community of interest necessarily. As Dr. Blair mentioned, race alone can't be a community interest, but areas related to racial dynamics absolutely can be. So, okay, so those are the criteria, and then I'll pause, Dr. Blair, if you want to jump in with anything on the criteria else that you'd like to share, go for it. And if not, I'd like to say a few more words on process just to give some dates, and then whatever the next section is, happy to go to it.
No, I want to also point out that although a community of interest may be along ethnic lines or language lines or religious lines, you can advocate, you can have more than one legislative agenda. It's nothing to say that because, again, we're talking about the Northern Bronx, Bronx and Manhattan, sometimes individuals in a particular community, they have multiple issues that have to be resolved, such as public education, such as affordable housing, such as cultural institutions. And so that's why the city council is extremely important in this process for redistricting, because one of the main things about city, especially in Manhattan or the Bronx, et cetera, all throughout the 5 boroughs, is our cultural institutions. Those are some of the things, or our institutions overall, that keep us together. You want to always keep in mind, where do your kids go to school? What church do you go to? Where do you shop? You might say to yourself, wow, it would be so convenient to shop here, but we don't have access to, or it's a lot of food, healthy foods is scarce in this community. And so you can have more than one. Don't think you're limited. Parks may be an issue in your district. And so you may have to come together around those issues as well, which again, the city council is pertinent to those issues. So you can have more than one legislative area. You just need to understand. And this is where the really why redistricting, I like to say, is a varsity sport, because you bring together all the issues. It's civic learning and engagement at the same time, because to wrap your head around what is a community interest, and it's not just race. It's not to say that it won't be a predominant race in there. It's just to say that it's not about race. For example, people of African descent, it could be African American, Caribbean, continental African, or Afro-Latino. So it's not, and each group could be in different areas advocating for different issues in different neighborhoods, in different districts. So I'll just leave it there.
Great. Thank you so much to both of you for kind of getting into the nitty gritty on redistricting. I know the power of the people lies in our ability to advocate for ourselves, and really to, like you're speaking of the communities of interest, understanding what it looks like to pack a district, what it looks like to crack a district, voter dilution, and all of that. But our real power comes in when we're able to then write our own testimony, where we can speak up, we can provide feedback to the commission. It's nice to have advocacy groups. There's so many that are doing good work, including the Unity Coalition and many others. APA Voice, I want to give them a shout out. And so many others who are doing this work, Citizens Union, Center for Law and Social Justice, ProDef, all of you. But community members need to be engaged in the process, right? So can you, Dan, kicking off with you, and I know that many people have said, well, how can I get involved in the redistricting process? How can I have a voice? If you're a community board member or a neighborhood advisory board member or just a part of your block association, how can they lend their voice and when can they do it?
Great. So I'll say a few things back to back to back, and then Dr. Blair kick in, of course, whenever. So first thing I do want to do is just make sure everyone has the dates and the how-tos and understands kind of how this whole thing is going to roll out. So sorry about that. Okay, so the timeline on this is, and it was sort of covered, but just to give some explicit dates and kind of talk about how this is going to work. As said, the preliminary hearings happened in June and July. And I will just say, overall, as an overall statement, Manhattan was not, I know we're doing Manhattan and Bronx today. Manhattan and Bronx were not, again, this is an overly general statement, not really showing up to those preliminary hearings, which were an opportunity for communities to say what they want their lines to look like for the next decade. And again, let that sink in. These lines will be in place for a full 10 years. So whatever changes happen now, we'll live with the consequences for some time. So, you know, Brooklyn and Queens, there are neighborhoods in Brooklyn and Queens where 150 people were showing up. And in Manhattan and the Bronx, you know, a good district had 10 or 15 people showing up to testify, right? So a lot of organizing needs to happen moving forward to ensure that you get the best lines that you feel best represent you. So that was June, July. July 15th, the first draft maps were made public. I hope we'll have time to go over those maps on this call, but it's looking tight. But if not, you can check out the website, New York City Redistricting and you can really kind of look through those lines yourselves. Then we have that 30-day window to analyze the lines to see if they work. And then August 16th, the hearings begin. So that is next week, hearings begin. The hearing dates are August 16th, 17th, 18th, 21st, and 22nd. You know what? Let me exit this screen for a second and show you the dates explicitly with the locations. I hope you can all see this. So these are the dates right at the top of the screen and the locations. It's mostly 5:30 to 9 p.m. to allow people after working hours to join. You can testify virtually or in person. I will drop the link in the chat, or maybe Farain, you can drop the link in the chat for how to register to testify. And in that registration, if you have, if you need a translator, if you have accessibility needs, you can mark that in your registration form so that you make sure your accommodations are met. So all of that is registering for the hearings, which I would say right now, this is the most critical time in the process. It's okay if you haven't yet didn't testify in the preliminary hearings, because now really is the critical time. And then, as was mentioned, they submit them to council. City council has the opportunity to reject or accept, and then potentially another round if accepted or rejected. But you know, we don't have time for that right now. If city council accepts it, in this first draft, which to be honest with you, I would doubt they will do because the speaker has come out against the maps. But if they do end up accepting it, that will mean that this is your only opportunity to engage in the process and your only opportunity left to make your voice heard on what you want. So these hearing dates, again, August 16th, 17th, 18th, 21st, and 22nd, are crucially important. They happen in each borough, so it's borough specific. But if you can't make the borough date that you live in, if you can't make, let's say you live in Manhattan and you can't make the hearing on the 22nd, you can testify at any other hearing to talk about the lines that you want. So that's a bit on the timeline. The next thing I will do for just 2 minutes, and then I'll do a couple minutes on testimony and hand it over, is map drawing. And again, this we'll have to do it very quickly, but it is one thing for you to say, I believe that my district should look like this. It's another thing to provide the commission with a map of how you think your district should look. In fact, that is a much more powerful testimony because you are showing them, hey, I live in this district and this is what it should look like. So it is a really powerful thing to do if you're trying to make your voice heard and you're trying to be effective in getting lines that you feel are most representative of your community. And it can feel overwhelming, but it actually is a fairly simple process, drawing these maps. So hopefully we can make this pretty user-friendly. So the website to use here is districtr.org/tag/NYC2022. Again, hopefully Farine can drop it in the chat. And if not, I will, after I'm done talking, drop a bunch of links in the chat. So if you scroll down here, if you click New York City Council Districts, it gives you a map. And then if you click your paintbrush, it gives you 51 different colors. Now, you do not need to paint 51 different council districts. If you just want your council district, let's say you live downtown and you just only care about what council district 1 looks like. So you click the first, if you hover over it, it says 1. You click 1 and you can go block by block right now with this brush size, right? Just going block by block, which you may want to be that precise, or you can go bigger. Now I'm doing this very randomly. I'm not actually recommending this map, but you see I'm starting to paint. And if you see at the bottom there to the right, the population is growing. That line is the population maximum. So you don't want to get above that. Again, I'm not actually recommending this. This is just random. And okay, let's say I'm happy with this. I drew this. Hopefully you do it more intentionally, but honestly, it doesn't need to take you all that long. Say you drew this, you can click save and then share to gallery, and it gets sent right to the commission. Or you can take that link, put it in your testimony, and they will see it that way too. So that is one thing. A second point to note here is if you click data layers and you click city council districts, it gives you the current council district, so you can kind of use that as a guide or think about that as as you start painting. You can do population by race. So if you want to see where different communities are, you can click that. And then let's say I want to see, I'm downtown right now. So let's say I want to see where the Asian American population is to ensure that they're entirely in the district I painted. You can click that on and you can see, okay, good. I got everybody that I was hoping to in whatever district I'm painting. So that is one. The other thing to show you on this website is you can work off their draft plan. So this is the draft plan that the commission submitted. Again, they recently, submitted this at July 15th. It has all the 51 colors and it works very similarly where you click the paintbrush. And if you want to start adjusting a district, you'll see that it starts adding the color down here. And if you hover over the district, it tells you which district it is. And then you can see.
Dan, can you zoom in a little more? Is it possible?
Totally.
Thank you.
Yeah. So right now I'm in Sunset Park. Again, we're talking about the Bronx today. Bronx and Manhattan. But honestly, you don't have to pay much attention to what I'm doing. More so, I'm just showing you how the tool works. But let's just say I was unhappy with how Chinatown looked. How CD1 looked, Council District 1. So I click on the blue and I can start painting, however. And you see on the right there that the numbers are growing. And so let's say this is what I liked. Great, but now you see I'm overpopulated. So now it is a jigsaw puzzle, and something to think about is when you start taking from one district, you have to replace the population to make sure it's all within the population boundaries. So then you click Council District 2 and try and take something from Council District 1 and so forth. And then finally, with this tool, and again, I only spending 2 minutes on it, but hopefully enough for you to play around with it. And honestly, once you start using it, I think it's user-friendly enough that you'll feel comfortable with it. If you don't care about the full district, but you just have your community, let's say you are, a school, your school district, you want to make sure is all within whatever district. You don't have to draw the full district. You can just say, hey, this circle right here is my community. Please make sure that whatever, however it's drawn, this stays whole. And so, you would draw it and then you'd write what your community is, you describe it, and same deal, you'd save it and you could send it right into the commission. So that is a very quick primer on map drawing. I'll turn it over to Dr. Blair to talk about how to testify. We want to give you some tips on just how to testify, somewhat of a structure, and then Dr. Blair, I'll happily pass it over to you.
Yeah, sure. I really want everyone in the audience to really pay attention to what Dan just did, because it's important that you understand your communities of interest. That if you take away nothing else from this presentation, it's about having that conglomerate of individuals in a small geographical area, or in that geographical area that you can grow or help to grow. Because like I said, people move for social reasons, cultural reasons, economic reasons, etc. And so what happens is, once people know that it is friendly to their community of interest, even if you don't have enough to elect your candidate of choice this time around, the community grows for the next round. And already we're into Census 2030, even before Census 2020 was complete. And so that's the number one way to get involved, by creating your own map. If you are technologically challenged, you can create your own map with words, if not a picture. Dan showed you where it was simple enough to go on the commission's website and click on District R and draw and play around with it. But if you say this is too much for me, then you can write out to the commission and tell them, this is where I think these boundaries could be, and that's just as effective. So the main thing is know your lines. Educate your peers. That's very, very important, because I also want you to take note of what he said before, what Dan said before about the number of individuals that came out in Brooklyn and Queens versus the number of individuals that came out in the Bronx. And so it's just like how many people call their elected officials. If they get 150 phone calls, they have to stop and look and see what's happening, or 10,000 letters. But if they only get 20 or 10 from one particular community or group, they're normally ignored. So I want you to really, really pay attention to that. So educate your peers and get, there's power in numbers. You want to make sure you tell the commission who you are. So your name, your address, your neighborhood, the length of time you've been in that. We have a lot of legacy families in particular neighborhoods in Harlem, in the Northern Bronx, in Central Bronx, etc. So put that point out there. That's important. I have lived in this community for 30 years or 20, however, my kids go here, go to this school, etc. That's very important, because it tells them that you have a stake in that community, and it tells them that you're a voter. Okay, that you really do care about selecting the candidate of your choice. You want to tell them why this is important to you, and you want to identify the issue, as we've been saying all along. What is the agenda? And so you also want to talk about your main interests, whether it's transportation, whether it's schools, whether it's cultural institutions, whether a community is growing and you want it to continue growing, so you have to, you want it to stay together. Keep in mind also, again, bring you back to population when you start drawing the districts. Most districts in Manhattan were overpopulated. Only 2 were underpopulated. So keep that in mind. And so that moving too much population into one district could oversaturate the district with a particular number, and you might be, quote unquote, packing that district, or moving it all around you may crack it. So look at what's in the population. Look, a good safe number for a percentage for a district is about for a predominant population or community of interest to select a candidate of your choice. If it's a majority, about 55%, 53%. It could be even lower if there's along a community of interest, because sometimes you don't have a majority language or ethnic group or religious group, but communities of interest go together. And so they'll vote together and they'll say, listen, we got to save this school. And so they will come together and do it along those lines. So you have what you call pluralities, 30% of one group, 30% another, but we have a common ground around transportation or around saving a particular community or school. So you really, this is a good time to really understand your geography, where you're located, and how you advocate for those interests. Yeah.
Okay, and just to bring to everyone's attention, thank you so much, Dr. Blair, for those tips on testimony writing. To bring to everyone's attention, we've been dropping information in the chat for you. It's also scrolling on the screen. So what's on the screen now is the public testimony email where you would need to go to submit your testimony. That's publictestimony@redistricting.nyc.gov. We also wanted to bring to your attention where you can draw your maps. It's in the chat, but it's also on the screen right now. Dan also mentioned it earlier. We're about the 7 o'clock mark, and we know that we have a few minutes left with all of you, and we want to make the most of it. So we're going to get into questions. And for our speakers, Dr. Blair and Dan, we've been dropping those questions in the private chat that we have. So you can take, when you're not speaking, take a moment to just kind of scroll through, look at those questions, but we're going to begin pulling them out one by one. So once again, we just want to bring to your remembrance that the next hearing for the Bronx is on August 17th at 5:30 to 9 p.m. It's on your screen. The next hearing for Manhattan is on Monday, August 22nd at 5:30 p.m. There will be hearings in other boroughs as well, Brooklyn and Queens. Whichever hearing you can make, that's the one you should show up for. Don't feel like, oh, I missed the Bronx and I live in the Bronx, I can't go to Brooklyn. If you have a vehicle and you want to get to Brooklyn or ride the train for 2 hours to get there, or if they have other means, I believe it's Dan, correct me if I'm wrong, you can do it virtually, right? If
all
you can
hearings are virtual and in person. And the other thing to say too, to add on to what Jamila is saying, is that if you can't make any hearing, and we really hope you can, because testifying in person is far more powerful, but you can email public testimony, the email address at any time. You can email that at any time with your testimony. So hopefully you can make a hearing in person. If you can't, say something. Get your voice in somehow. So it's so critically important. Yeah.
Yes, and that email address is on the screen as well. So let's get into our questions. Oh, I hear thunder. Okay, let's get into our questions. Where are they? The first question that we had is, I'm scrolling up, drum roll, please. It says, how can you preserve districts with gentrification and indirect racism? Dr. Blair, do you want to take that question? I think you might be muted.
Sure. This is where census data really becomes important. Knowing the count, knowing if you're overpopulated. If you're overpopulated, you can shed population, and you usually will want to shed population that is not a part or has less in common with your community of interest, and maybe more in common with the district next door. So that's why we give you the census numbers, knowing how much probably each block is. So for example, a census block can range anywhere from and track from 500 to 3,000 individuals, making sure that housing developments are kept together. That often preserves the population density in your community. So again, knowing the population count, it's keen there, and knowing how much to shed. And if you're underpopulated, then you add more communities of interest and try to keep it as compact as possible, but you add population knowing where these populations are. So again, since we're doing Bronx and Manhattan, knowing where individuals are and knowing a clear demarcation line for that district. So for example, Gun Hill Road is a clear demarcation line in the Northern Bronx. For decades also, that Wakefield area has been separated from that community. And it's a similar community of interest, Caribbean, et cetera, do the same school districts, et cetera, in that Wakefield, White Plains Road area. So if it's underpopulated, you will more than likely want to sort of shift that population over to that particular district, for example, to make sure that your community meets the population goal, it keeps the community intact, and it preserves or is able to preserve the district for the next 10 years. So these are sort of the glues that you look for, the glue: population, the institutions, the popular strips, business strips, et cetera, that would be the glue to keep the communities together. So I would say along those lines. Park space, another particular thing that could also keep communities together. Tomorrow when we do Queens, you'll see like Roy Wilkins Park is a really, really big thing. In Manhattan, the Rucker Park, right? Really, really, really big thing to keep the communities together. So you want to look for those glues and those passions. Again, comes back to community of interest, but along those lines, yes.
Thank you so much for all of that. So they should look at parks, they should look at clear demarcation lines, and that's pretty much how they can determine how to preserve their districts. Okay, we'll go to the next question. There's a few questions, so we want to get through them all. Dan, if you want to piggyback on that, let me know. If not, I'll go to the next question.
There's 10 billion things to say. I think that the question itself is profound, and we can have 10,000 more Zooms about gentrification and racism and how to work on those things. I think inherently in this process, gentrification especially, I think, is one that city government has a massive role to play in. And how lines are, again, so this process does not inherently affect gentrification, except that how council lines are drawn affects who represents those districts, and who represents those districts will play a role in how policy moves to affect those issues. And so I'd say in that way it matters. And certainly thinking about, I'll touch on the next question because it's a similar answer to me about issues of affordability and rent. And I forget the exact question, but those sort of essential housing issues, which all of us are concerned about, all of us think about a lot. If you put, let's say, a sliver of a renter community into and group them into a district with lots of homeowners, as an example, chances are the voices of those renters are going to be much smaller. If you think back to that slide I showed earlier on, where the communities of interest was split up into all these different districts, right? That's going to hurt the renters in that community and maybe citywide. So, so in that way, I'd say it matters for those issues. Redistricting doesn't take on a specific issue. It's all the issues because it affects representation on every issue across the board. So
ultimately representation matters, like we've been saying.
Yeah. It's about representation, which exactly, yeah.
Okay, so that you pretty much answered the next question, but I just want to read it out loud so people know what the question was. And the question was, I'm interested in how the decisions will affect the circles of rent, lottery of apartments served in percentages, and how the changes of the boundaries will hurt or help the communities of low-income families. And I know you've answered a portion of it. Was there anything else you wanted to chime in for this question, Dr. Blair? Or do you want us to move to the next one?
No, we can go to the next question.
Okay, got it. So thank you for that question, for asking that. Okay, let's go to the next question. Next question is, okay, I think that might be the only two questions. I thought I saw more questions in the chat, more questions and statements.
Since we have a couple extra minutes, can I say a bunch of things that we had to move past quickly. Is that okay?
Sure. Let me just go into the comments
Yeah.
and see if I can pull any more questions out.
Okay, cool. So while there's a lot to say, and hopefully we skim the surface of at least what's going on. But one thing I do want to say to kind of help encourage folks to testify is that testimony historically really has swayed this process. So, for anyone who watched the state process, which was really as bad as you can think of in many ways, really a disaster in a lot of ways. Or just if you've tried to organize with city government in general, and sometimes it's banging your head against a wall, this process doesn't always end like that. So I want to share my screen and just go over a couple historical examples where everyday folks have organized, have, engaged in the process and have gotten what they wanted. So what I'm going to pull up here is the justification for why the commission chose the lines they did 10 years ago. It's a really interesting document. So again, this is the 2012 commission, and this is their writing on, what their reasoning is for choosing different lines. So today we're going to the Bronx and Manhattan. We're talking about, we didn't do too many specifics, but
Can you zoom in, Dan?
Yeah, let me go on a little more. Okay, so I'm going to pull up District 8, but honestly, there's many different districts I can choose, but this one is a crossover district, so it's both Bronx and Manhattan. And what I want to highlight is this section right here. So the commission's proposed District 8 is also drawn to accommodate many of the community's concerns raised during commission's public hearings. In response to public testimony, La Marqueta, El Museo, Mount Sinai, etc., identified by the public as important institutions and cultural landmarks, are kept within District 8. Randall's Island also remains in District 8 as envisioned by an alternative plan by Common Cause. Right. So what I'm showing you this for is that, historically, or last time, 10 years ago in District 8, people came out, raised concerns in this preliminary plan, right? They came out with this preliminary plan, and the community came out and said, hey, we really need Mount Sinai in our district, and we really need Randall's Island in our district too. And the commission listened, right? I'll show another example also in the Bronx, but really, we can do this all day. So let me show District 13. So District 13 here, I'll just zoom into this part. I'll resume right here. So in response to public testimony, the revised plan keeps the Van Ness neighborhood in districts 13 and 15 instead of dividing the area into 3 council districts as proposed in the previous preliminary plan. Right. So here I'm going to go and just show you on a map what they're talking about. This is the population fact finder tool, an amazing tool that's worth playing around with. So if we look into Van Ness, I just clicked on the council district lines, which are the blue lines. And zooming into Van Ness in the Bronx, we see that it has been split in half. Now, 10 years ago, the plan split them into 3, right? People from Van Ness, during the hearings that are coming out, the equivalent of the hearings coming out in next week, came out during those hearings and said, hey, we really can't be split into 3. And again, the commission listened. And ultimately, still not ideal. They got split into 2, but certainly better than 3. This time around, they again came out pretty strongly during those initial preliminary hearings. And this time, this is now what I'm showing you is the preliminary plan that the commission just proposed in July. If we look, Van Ness is all in Council District 13, which is what they were asking for, right? So I'm showing you this, and there's honestly many historical examples of this where communities organize and they get what they want. Now, I'm not guaranteeing that you will get what you want if you come out, but certainly I can say if you don't say anything, and if you don't get engaged in this process, that classic saying, closed mouths don't get fed, certainly rings true here, right? That not organizing certainly will it will allow the commission to not know what your preferences are, where historically, in many cases, when people organize, when people show up to these, they get lines that are favorable, that they feel best represent them. So I hope that encourages you to show up in these hearings in August.
Thank you so much for that, Dan. Dr. Blair, were you going to say something?
Yeah, so I see a question, how does redistricting plays into money already allocated to existing districts? So I would just say this, and I don't know if this answers your question or not, but it's a big deal, because if sometimes the lines move and things that a city council person may have funded are no longer in the district. What I would say this is, if you know who your state and federal representatives are, and you know that they work together with the city council person, and this is where you really need to become more engaged. A lot of money have come down from the federal government because of COVID, et cetera. And the state and the local government spend it, right? Especially around classroom size, et cetera. And so you want to make sure that also your districts are, and your communities of interest are aligned with, as much as possible, because the population counts are different, with your state representative. A good example of that is Harlem, right? With the state elected official, with the congressional elected official, because they often consider themselves by counties as a delegation who talk about the different issues. And so that federal funding, they may ask when they meet, where should this money go? Well, we want a women's health clinic, or we want certain things. And so it comes down to a local issue, because all politics are local, but it's the conversations that these individuals or these representatives are having, whether it's the community board level, or at the city or state or federal level, and they're working together oftentimes to bring home the resources to address similar issues. So that's also another factor to look into, to make sure that your district, your city council district, doesn't have 5 different representatives, doesn't have 5 different congressional representatives, 4 different state representatives. That's another way to look at it as well.
Thank you so much. There is one other question, which I think can probably be answered in 30 seconds by dropping the, okay, my computer is not behaving. By just dropping the link, but it says, how do I get a map of how do I get a map of my district or the proposed district? And I believe we had dropped that before. Dan, do you want to just drop that in the chat for us one more time? And I think Farain has also dropped it in the chat. Farain has been amazing monitoring the chat tonight.
And I also just want to give a plug, the Unity Map Coalition. We have a map on Redistricting and You. You can go online and review it and make comments, or email us. You can go to clsj.org website and review the maps there as well, or any of the other organizations. And yeah, so you can go to your city council, the city council website, look at your district, your city council member, you can see a map there, the existing lines, or you could go to the commission, and Dan also was just now showing all the different variations of the maps in District R.
Okay.
And can I make a plug too?
Absolutely. Plug
So,
away.
gosh, an hour 15 goes by quick. We tried our best to give you a lot of information, and yet there's still a mountain more. And if you're feeling really confused about the process, or even just want advice on crafting a testimony, or want feedback on your testimony, you're welcome to email me, and I presume Dr. Blair, but I don't want to volunteer you without consent. But you're welcome to reach out to us, and happy to really help you navigate this very confusing process however we can. And the other thing to say is that Citizens Union has a website, citizensunion.org/NYC Redistricting. And that is much more just sort of everything that we tried to go over in this training, plus more resources, links, videos, etc., to help you navigate the process. So hopefully that can help too. And again, we're totally here for you to help you engage however you would like.
So you hear that, everyone? Dan said it. We are here for you. You have the links. They're in the chat. Please take some time, copy those links, click on them, research the information that's being provided for you. Email those of us the emails that they've mentioned. You could also email our office at gethelp.nyc.gov. Redistricting is going to be fun, and we're going to go through this process all together. So thank you so much to Dr. Blair, the director of, hold on, let me say this correctly, the
It's
director of the Redistricting Center for the Center for Law and Social Justice at Medgar Evers College. And also thank you so much to Dan Kaminski, Policy Manager at Citizens Union, for really taking us down this winding road of redistricting for New York City, which again, we are redrawing the lines for New York City Council. If you have any further questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. Our team will be monitoring the chat for some time. If not, have a great night. And to the Bronx and Brooklyn people, Queens and Brooklyn people, if you happen to be on here, we'll see you tomorrow. Please share this information. Even though we're going to be ending the live, it's evergreen. Someone can watch it later. So for those of you who may be watching tomorrow or next week before the hearings, the information is still pretty much evergreen, and take advantage of it. Thank you so much. I'm going to bring Faraine Griffith back up just to say goodbye. Dan, before she does that, Dan and Dr. Blair, do you have any last words?
Thank you for listening. Thank you for having. Please go out and testify in your respective boroughs. And if you miss one, you can. If you missed the Bronx and you live in the Bronx, you can always go to the Schaumburg and do that one. So you can testify about your respective area at any hearing. It doesn't have to be limited to that borough.
Yeah, and just echoing what Dr. Blair said, firstly, thank you so much for the Public Advocate's Office putting this together. Been amazing partners. Dr. Blair, thank you so much for all the work you're doing. It's a pleasure, and I hope to see you at the hearings. I'll be at most of them. So, and feel free to come up and chat and ask me any questions, and I'm here to help. So,
thank you. Thank you, Dan, and thank you.
Faraine, did you just want to close us out?
Yes, I just wanted to make sure that you was back on screen. I thought you had dropped off. Again, I want to thank you to our partners, Citizens Union, the Center for Law and Social Justice, and Medgar Evers College. I hope you all will be testifying. You got your crayons and your pens and your markers ready to draw your map and share your community of interest at the upcoming hearings. All of the links have been dropped in the chat. And have a great night. Thank you all.